Okay, we're back again with Larry Winters, who is the Assistant Chief of the Laurel Springs Fire Department, and he's going to give us the history of it. Welcome, Larry.
Hello, Mrs. Hawk. I guess I'll start back in 1893. There was a group of men that got together in the railroad station for the Atlantic City Railroad, and they decided that the borough of Laurel, well, it wasn't the borough back then, but the area of Laurel Springs needed some sort of fire protection. They were starting to do building, and Mr. Cord was speculating on lots, and they needed some sort of fire protection. And I'm sure, I don't know this for a fact, but it was done because of a fire that they may have had. And they decided they want to start a fire company, and they did so. They sent a notice out to the residents that every male resident in this town was a member. Boy, would I like to do that now. They secured a lot and a barn over on the Stafford property next to where the Whitman house is, and they turned that into a fire station. They secured a hand-drawn chemical wagon that actually was a bucket brigade type of truck, and that's what they used up until the time they started using chemical wagons. A chemical wagon contained a tank that contained a mixture of water and bicarbonate of soda, and in the tank was a cup that contained sulfuric acid. And when you mixed the sulfuric acid with the bicarbonate, it would expel the water out of the hose lines. Of course, once the tank was empty, you were done. But that's what they used. And they used hand-drawn apparatuses. There were very few fires back then. One fire I know of was at the house at Fairmount and Grand. The roof burned off of that, and the men of the fire company responded to that. But there was very few fires back then, a couple a year maybe, and there was always brush fires because there was still a lot of undeveloped area in the town. Right. Around 1904, there were several members broke away from fire company number 1. The reason, unfortunately, is lost to time. I don't know if it was because of infighting, maybe not. I might mention that there were dozens of high-speed trains coming through town at that point. There had been a bridge built over Maple Avenue over the tracks, which allowed the fire company to get over to that side of town. But the area over Beach and Glen, you know, you got a bunch of guys pulling a hand-drawn cart. It's going to take you a while to get there.
Oh my goodness.
And there was also a danger factor with all the trains that were coming through town. That may have been the reason. The actual reason, I don't know, but the members of, they decided we're going to start another fire company number 2. They secured a lot, and they built a building down in the 1100 block of Stone Road. The building is still there. They secured an apparatus that matched the apparatus of fire company number 1. And they were known to go as far away as Lindenwold, Gibbsboro, Clementon with their hand-drawn apparatus. Can you imagine pulling a wagon that far just to go to a fire?
No way.
So things went along until 1914. 1914, the borough of Laurel Springs, who had just been incorporated in 1913, decided that they should start appropriating funds for the fire companies for their use. And the borough went out and they bought a brand new fire truck, a 1914 Model T Ford chemical truck. This Ford had 2 chemical tanks on it that worked just like I told you, and it was built by the American LaFrance Company. A twin to it is still in existence in Merchantville.
Oh, cool.
So records show that this truck was shared with fire company number 1. Sometimes it was over here, number 1, and sometimes it was over in 2. But most of the pictures I've seen of it, it was operated by fire company number 2. The members of fire company number 1, they decided they were going to assemble their own chemical truck, and they decided to go out and buy a Chevrolet chassis. And they hand built it. It was a 1920 Chevrolet chemical truck. And this began a practice of hand building fire trucks to serve the purpose that you need. So they each had a truck that they could use up until the mid-20s when the borough decided they were going to modernize the fire companies. They purchased 2 Hale pumpers, one for fire company number 1 and fire company number 2. The following year, they bought a ladder truck. Now, it wasn't a ladder truck that had the aerial ladder went up. It was a ladder truck that carried a amount of ground ladders up to 45 feet. They bought one of those. That went over to Fire Company number 2, and then the following year they bought another chemical truck, which was a modern chemical truck for that time, which had 4 tanks on it, and that went over to Fire Company number 1. So the late 20s, the fire companies in town were in very good shape as far as equipment. The buildings were decent. Fire Company number 1's building wasn't that great, but Fire Company number 2's building was in really good shape. And I might mention the school, the second school that was in town was built in 1902, which was down on Stone Road, which was next to Fire Company number 2.
Yeah.
And when that became overcrowded, they did teach classes up on the second floor of the firehouse.
Oh my goodness.
So we're into the 20s, and things went along until I guess the membership started declining, and there was talk about merging the 2 fire companies. It was just, the town was just not big enough to have 2 fire companies.
Right.
The amount of trains had dwindled after the merger of the Atlantic City Railroad and the West Jersey Railroad, and it became the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines. The railroad in town used to go directly to Atlantic City, as did the West Jersey. And you would get down near Atlantic City, and the trains actually used to race each other to get in there.
Oh
So
my
after the
goodness.
1933 merger, they abandoned this track below Winslow and merged this track into the other one. So there was less trains here then.
Right.
So in 1939, they had meetings with the borough, and they decided that they were going to turn both of their fire stations over to the borough. And the borough had built by FDR's WPA station on Thomason Avenue, which was right next to the Samuel Cord Mansion, which had been acquired by the town to be used as a borough hall.
Right.
And that was going to be the headquarters for the operations of the borough. They merged the fire companies. They retained one engine, the chemical truck and the ladder truck, and in 1939 they moved into the fire headquarters. The first chief of the merged fire companies was Lewis Snyder. He had been a member of Fire Company number 2, and I don't know where he lived.
Okay.
But after 1 year into it, in 1940, he decided to step down, and Russell Foreman took over as chief. Russell Foreman lived on Madison Avenue, right near the church here. Had been a member of Fire Company number 1, and he was chief until 1952. He was off a year and came back and was chief until 1963. He is our longest tenured chief. A couple other names I should mention: the chiefs of the old companies: Nat Alexander Sr., David Myers, Edward Maurer. David Myers was Whitney Myers' father.
Oh, okay.
He was a fire chief in town. So during the 1940s, a lot of the firefighters were drafted or called to war, and they started a junior fire department, and the junior fire department basically was who fought the fires in town for a couple years. A couple names that were involved with this junior fire department at that time was Sam Reiner, Hap Bryson, Bob Moran, Al Stack, Thomas Schusted, Jacob Mick. That's about all I can come up with right now.
That's pretty lot, yeah.
But they helped out during the war greatly. After the war, they found out that the trucks were pushing 20 years old, and they were in bad shape. And they went to the government war surplus to see if they could get. They were selling military fire trucks that had become surplus after the end of the war, and they had hundreds of them available. And a lot of the towns took advantage of this offer and went up and drove this back. We got the truck in 1946. It was a 1942 Chevrolet government issue pumper. The following year, they decided they were going to replace the chemical truck, and they hand-built another pumper. They took a war surplus pump that had its own motor, put it on a chassis of a truck, and built a tank and fabricated it all themselves.
You'll say the
They
actual
plumbed it.
fireman.
They plumbed it themselves. They did all the plumbing, and all the work they did themselves. The chassis came from Houchins Motor, which was a Dodge dealer at Hemlock and the Pike,
Right.
on the opposite side in Lindenwald.
And then the wall.
And they built it. They built that truck in 1954. They replaced the ladder truck, and it's gone along since then. That's basically it in a nutshell.
Right.
I'll mention some of the chiefs. After Mr. Snyder already mentioned, Russell Foreman, Pat Alexander, Al McKeever, Al Cassia, Vernon Leeds, Newt Applegate, John Walker, Bob Thompson, myself, John Freed, and Kenny Cheeseman. I feel I'm leaving somebody else out. Bob will have to help me with that one.
Right.
We're basically at the same location we've always been in. The fire company was built in 1939. Became really, it was too small for the modern trucks. It's been modified over the years. The first major modification took place in 1985, where they brought the front out and put a peak roof on it. And then 2 years ago, we had the station rebuilt by the town into what we have now.
Now, did the participation grow over the years? I mean, was it?
Unfortunately, volunteerism is dying out, and
Yes.
we don't have the manpower that we used to do.
Right.
But our fire company was it's always been a very close-knit organization.
Right.
They socialized together, especially back in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were involved at that point,
Right.
and they were just, they were very good, and they played together and they worked together.
Right.
There's been some devastating fires over the years. The restaurant fire in the center of town where they lost a 12-year-old boy. That really brought them together.
Yes.
They tried to attempt a rescue, and it just wasn't to be. There's always been a legend about a fire that took place back in the early 1900s. It was Mick's Hardware Store and Stables. And that was where our most famous fireman came into being. The Hall of Fame pitcher Rube Waddell, used to play for the Philadelphia A's, was down visiting some friends, and apparently they say, legend has it, he did 14 men's work with an axe, and
Oh my
got
goodness.
the hose so close his clothes started to sizzle. But he used to play for Connie Mack, and Connie Mack would have to send the rest of the players out to get Waddell because he'd be chasing fire trucks in the streets of Philadelphia.
Oh my goodness.
He was a buff. Probably the worst fire we've ever had in this town as far as property damage took place in 2001, which was the old movie theater, which had been converted into apartments and a warehouse. The fire
Right.
started in the warehouse, and it burnt to the ground.
Right.
But it's always been a close-knit organization. We received a grant for a ladder truck a couple years ago from the government, and that really has kept us going, and we're doing quite well.
Right. And then the ladies' auxiliary.
Yeah, the ladies' auxiliary was started very early on.
Was it?
Maybe, yeah,
Okay.
a couple years even after the fire company was established. But certain groups came and went, and it wasn't until the late 50s. It was 1958 to be exact, when the group of ladies at that time, which was headed by my mother, Mildred, got together, and they had hoagie sales. They did everything they could to help out. They were a very active group.
Right.
They even got to the point where if there was a fire call, they would come out and serve coffee. And we had actually probably the first what they call rehab unit after the restaurant fire. We had a police chief by the name of Alfred Lickfield, and Chief Lickfield was looking at this fire, and it was cold, and there was a lot of guys that got hurt, minor injuries, nothing major, but there was still a great deal of it. And Chief Lickfield came up with the idea of an on-scene unit that could take care of this problem that we were having at these fires.
Right.
And even if it was a bus. So there was 10 men that put up $50 apiece and bought a PTC bus from Philadelphia.
Oh, man.
They put $50 in, and back in 1960, $50 was a lot of
Oh,
money.
yes.
Some of the men who were involved, I could probably name them all if I thought about it. My dad was one of them, Mr. Lickfield, Mickey Lyons, Charlie Lang, who was the captain of police, Russ Foreman, Jack Hagan. These guys, and when they brought the bus back, they worked. They cut trees to make the money to pay for the repairs to the bus. They took the seats out and they put counters in it and examination table. They even had doctors on call. Dr. Herring was a big backer of the
Was he?
of the
Cool,
bus.
yes.
Also, Dr. Bream, our local doctor.
Yes.
These doctors were supposed to be on call where if they had a disaster, the doctors would come out. And they would run this bus. It had a generator on it, and it was quite an operation, well ahead of its time, probably too much ahead of its time. And but the problem was the bus was decrepit when they got it, and it was really falling apart by the time they decided to do away with it. But the ladies' auxiliary would come out and they would be on the bus and make coffee, and it was really something to respond to the call on the bus.
Oh, yes, definitely.
My
Right,
dad was
yeah.
the driver.
Mhm.
But it was dedicated to Chief Lickfield because he passed away right before the bus was put into service. And 1963, they had a major celebration in town where they got a new fire truck, and this was the first all-new factory-made fire truck since the 20s. That's the ones that Burr had bought in the 20s because we had the war surplus one,
Oh,
the hand-built one.
Right.
The other one, the ladder truck, had been hand-built. So they had a major celebration for that. And that truck served our town up until 1990, and we got rid of it. Well, in 2002, we found out where the truck was, and we contacted the company just to see how the truck was doing. And that was in Tennessee, Cornersville, Tennessee.
I remember.
And they said, well, the truck's fine. Do you want it back? Well, we want $8,000 for it. Well, you're not. And one thing led to another, and they asked us if we had any old equipment, so we sent the old equipment down and got the truck back. So that truck is back, and our GI military vehicle we got back also from Lower Bank, the company we sold it to. So right now we have about 20 members and active. Because the volunteerism has been lower, we have a lot more out-of-town responses. We're running with Lindenwold, and Lindenwold is running with us, Stratford.
Okay.
That's the way we have to do it to make to have enough personnel.
Then when did fire prevention start? Like when you guys started going to the schools and everything?
They've done that ever since I can remember, I go back. I go back to the 50s as far as memory goes.
Right.
All in Laurel, and that was a highlight, of course, of my year because my dad would come in and he'd be the fireman come in there just like I did for my children.
Yes.
In the school. I have a granddaughter that's a fourth generation going to Laurel Springs School, and I'm sure there's other fourth generations going to there. So now my son, who's a captain in the fire department, is going to see his daughter.
Like how many fire trucks do we have now?
Well, there's four.
Okay.
There's a utility truck, a pickup, a pumper, a truck we call a squad, which can do rescue work,
Oh, okay.
and then the ladder truck, the Quint. We call it Quint because it serves 5 functions.
Ah.
But the fire company is permanently intertwined in this town. They've done Santa Claus
Right.
for many, many years.
As long as I can remember.
I know I've personally been a Santa Claus for a lot of years.
Oh, yeah.
4th of July celebrations, they've done those. Memorial Day. These are things the fire company have always done. There's the Halloween parade for the kids, which is coming up.
Right.
They've always done that. And these were just born out of ideas that these members had that wanted to do something for the town.
Right. And we're truly blessed for all the stuff that they do,
Well,
and the time that they give. Yeah.
We get rewarded, believe me.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
Oh, yes. And it's
we
just,
enjoy
like I
doing it.
said, it's just, it's unique. You know, I mean, I know there are other fire companies, but I think our fire company is pretty unique. You know, when you listen to what other
I like
fire
to think
companies.
so.
Yeah, I mean, because you hear about other fire companies, and we're just truly blessed and
I
unique.
feel that our fire company is unique because when they respond to a call, we also go above and beyond as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, yes.
If somebody calls that they have water in their basement, we go down and clean the water out of the basement. Where
Pools.
other fire companies would say, well, that's not on fire, so I'm not going to do
Right.
that.
And you do
So,
pools.
yeah. So
Yeah, so we're right. Anything else?
that's it in a nutshell.
That's it in a nutshell. Very nice. Thank you ever so much. We appreciate it. Your knowledge is wonderful. Cut.